Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Civil Clarity Reports. I'm one of your three hosts, John Noel, along with Jody Kirk and Marty Espinosa. And on today's show, we have Mr. Mike Solan, who is president of the Seattle Police Officer Guild. And I will turn it over to Marty to continue the introduction. Marty.
Hey, welcome, Mike. Good to see you.
Hey, Marty. Thanks for having me on, man.
After all this time, got you on there.
Yeah, but we'd exchanging emails and trying to figure out a good time frame to collaborate on this conversation, and here we are.
Yeah. Well, rather than me mess up your bio, how about giving us just a little bit of some details about your career with the police department and your guild presidency?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so I've been on the job here in Seattle for 24 years. Did my time in patrol operations, work in the Rainier Valley for most of my patrol experience at night. Really enjoyed that experience. Then I did a couple of years as a detective in the department's gang unit, where I investigated major assaults with knives or gunshot wounds or any kind of large instrument that would maim people. That was an interesting experience as well. And then I had an opportunity to try out for the full-time Seattle Police SWAT team. And luckily I was accepted, and I did the better part of my career with the Seattle SWAT team. Amazing group of people, quality professionals, as most of us are in the Seattle Police Department. And in about 2013, while I was in SWAT, I decided to get more involved in the union. And with Seattle, the union represents, which is the largest police labor union in the Pacific Northwest. We represent officers, detectives, and sergeants. In 2013, I decided to run for a board position, and a board position is elected by the people we represent, and I was humbly elected into office. And then I just continued to run for re-election every 2 years, and I decided to get more involved as I saw the political winds shift here dramatically in Seattle. So I was like, I think I need to get in and try to right the ship, if you will. And luckily, I was elected as the vice president, which is an executive board position, in 2019. And then I ran for the presidency in 2020, and I was elected president. So I'm into my second term. And as you know, in the past 3 years, it's been pretty crazy here in Seattle. And I think, it's kind of why we're having this conversation today.
And I know that you were doing the collective bargaining recently, trying to re-up your contract.
Yeah. So
do you have any happy news about that?
I wish. Well, I think the fact that we're still bargaining. So just back up for your audience. The main job of a police union is to advocate for the members. And that's around the three pillars of the advocacy, which is hours, wages, and working conditions. And that's the main role, is to procure a contract. And then as we're doing that, I think of late, we've had to really focus on the working conditions where the officers operate under. And as you know, within 3 years since 2020, we've lost close to 600 officers. So we're now below 900 people. I think we're operating around 887, where we should be operating over 1,300. It's a stunning statistic, and public safety is paying the price. And to your point, we're still negotiating with the city, and it's been positive so far. And we look forward to continuing the conversation to obtain a fair and competitive labor contract. It's now been 2.5 years. We've been working under an expired contract, and we need to procure one. So it's got to be incumbent upon our elected officials to get it over the goal line, along with our collaboration. And I think we've been doing a reasonable professional job at the table to get our people the respect they deserve. Because it's my understanding that we're now 18th in the state in terms of the rate of pay. And I think due to this climate in Seattle, and we've predominantly always been the top paid agency across the state. Now we're number 18. We got to get back to the top just to get people here to want to be police officers in Seattle.
And what kind of uphill battles are you fighting with trying to get this done with the city council, city fathers, the mayor? I know you have some success with the mayor, I think, but a little bit of communication, good communication with him, from my understanding.
Yeah, I speak with Mayor Harrell. I also speak with the deputy mayor, although Monisha is moving on, as the reports of yesterday confirmed. Good working relationships with the executive branch. In terms of the council, I have some good relationships with several within the council. I think the others that voted to defund us and go against their pledge that they pledged just less than a year before 2020 to fully fund SPD and try to get more officers to protect the city. Obviously, they flip-flopped on that and pledged to defund us by 50%. I think the city is still reeling from that disaster of a decision. Evidence of that is the political climate we find ourselves in terms of the public safety policing conversation. But there's room, I think, to rectify those mistakes. And we're bargaining in good faith. And I think we've got good momentum on our side, but we can't lose another officer. So we're losing more people than we are gaining. And no reasonable person sees Seattle as a realistic landing pad to be a police officer because, like I illustrated earlier, very toxic political climate to be the cop here. There is an activist mindset that controls most of our elected officials, and they do their bidding. And I think that's led to a lack of leadership, which has obviously contributed to losing 600 people. The lack of a competitive, fair labor contract, 2.5 years expired. You're not going to have anybody really want to gravitate to be a Seattle cop. The draw isn't there anymore. So you have to incentivize people to want to come here. And how do you do that? You do it by providing a fair and competitive labor contract. It's still a great job. I love this agency, but we're in a real tough time right now.
Yes.
Mike, can you give us I think most of America saw after the death of George Floyd, the occupation in Chaz in Seattle, but can you kind of give us a snapshot of what most police officers were experiencing in the summer of 2020 on the streets of Seattle?
Well, and I always paint the backdrop of that just a week before the tragedy and the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, clear across the country from Seattle. We were basically applauded and put on a pedestal in a public relations campaign, illustrating to the community that the Seattle Police Department have met all the benchmarks of Department of Justice reform in the conversation revolving around the settlement agreement, the consent decree. The mayor did this, and then they were advocating, and they had drafted language with the Department of Justice to terminate the settlement agreement, which means DOJ would not have oversight of the Seattle Police Department anymore because we had met the benchmarks of reform in record amount of time. In fact, the talking point was have other agencies across the nation come to Seattle and learn from us how we got to such a level of high competence and professionalism in a record amount of time to meet the benchmarks laid out by the Department of Justice settlement agreement, the consent decree. Fast forward a week later, tragedy strikes in Minneapolis, and all of law enforcement is under a microscope. And roughly 2 days into it, we started seeing the results of the community's uproar of policing in Minneapolis, and that was directed at us because we represented law enforcement across the nation. So it's a very difficult time. We've since that, during those riots, which were tragic, most of the violence occurred at night. We were literally thrown under the bus by our elected leaders. So much for the week prior, the applauding of our work. Now we were the worst things ever, and we had nothing to do with George Floyd. So you could just imagine how that impacts your psyche as a police officer here in Seattle, that you were applauded for the reform work you did. And then a week later, it was quickly erased. And we had hundreds of officers get injured from the riots, and many of them career-ending injuries. Some officers to this day are suffer from PTSD, and the political climate, although it's slightly changing here, is still toxic. And that's why I can continue to advocate that the only way you're going to retain your current professional police officers that decided to stick with it post 2020, you're going to have to provide them with a fair competitive labor contract. And then that will open the door to recruit new people here. It's going to take at least at a minimum a decade to recover from the amount of staffing losses. But that's just not isolated to Seattle. I think the profession as a whole is struggling to recruit anybody across the nation. But more specific to Seattle, we're still struggling. The accountability structure here is the most strict in the nation. And yet the activist groups continue to push for more accountability, and we're happy to bargain accountability at the table. And that seems to be the crux of the continued conversation when you talk about collective bargaining with the union and the city. Accountability conversation seems to be the major component. So, it's not all great here for the people, but as the union head, I have to reflect a positive, optimistic outlook that things are to get better. And I have no doubt that things will get better. The political climate is slowly changing. And I think the Seattle community is seeing the crime impact their individual doorstep. And the fallout from city council's vote last week or a week and a half ago of not adopting the new state drug law as city ordinance, I think is evidence that the people are fed up. And then just days after, in that same council member's district, that was the swing vote that decided against to enact the city attorney's drug ordinance, which would largely reflect the state's law on narcotics. An unfortunate incident occurred where a business owner, an Asian American, was gunned down in broad daylight, and her 32-week-old unborn baby died in the same act of violence. So I mean, that's kind of where we are. And so as your police officer, you're working under an environment where the agency, due to the laws that are in place and political decisions, have policied ourselves out of being an effective police service. And we're literally handcuffed from being able to successfully do our jobs. And I don't say that lightly. That's what I deal with on a daily basis, the level of frustration.
That leads me to a question I would have for you. Is there anything that police officers or their union reps can do to get those policies changed? Because these policies are being put in place by our local politicians and bureaucrats. They're leaning towards a bad situation for society as a whole. I know they're demanding accountability, but I don't think everybody's looking at the fact that they're also demanding accountability out of those elected leaders that are in violation of those rules and only getting smacked on the hand for it. So as a union rep and as a police officer, is there anything your side can do to help get those policies changed?
Well, we can certainly advocate in the public sphere, as we've done for a long period of time since 2020, under my direction, to wade into the political conversation in terms of media and narratives. It's one of the reasons why, I started my Hold the Line with Mike Solan podcast. You can find it on all podcast streaming platforms, YouTube and Rumble. Definitely find us on Twitter, SeattlePoliceOfficers.com. That's one avenue that we can impact what you're describing. The other is getting involved with the politics when it comes to people being elected into office. The bottom line is, when you look on average, historically, when it comes to voting in the city, roughly 20 to 24% of the time, that's the voting turnout. So you've got to look at, okay, if you have that meager of an amount of people that participate in an election, who really gets the vote out then? Well, it's the activist groups that get the vote out. And it's difficult to then try to advocate for reasonable and moderate approaches when you're met with a small group of activists who are very loud that don't truly reflect the Seattle constituents. So, at the end of the day, it comes down to the voter. The voters are in control of how politics plays out here in the city. The union's job is to advocate for working conditions, hours, and wages. And we do that by bargaining and getting into the accountability conversation. That's kind of the extent of our power. I mean, a lot of the stuff we do is informal, behind the scenes, with developing relationships with people within the community to advocate on police officers to change policy. A lot of it's done in Olympia as well, where we need to advocate to change the laws within Olympia. But as we saw post 2020, the police power base in terms of lobbying efforts were not unified. And I think that leads to the detriment of our profession. It's one of the reasons why we belong to a national group called United Coalition of Public Safety. It's a coalition of police unions and associations across the nation to advocate on narratives and supporting legislation in DC on the Hill to better our working conditions, which would therefore improve our policies in our local jurisdictions. And I think that group were having a significant impact. But again, all politics is local. And you have to walk a fine line of balance between holding our elected officials accountable in the public narrative sphere and the media sphere, but also then bargain a contract and knowing that those same council members that voted to defund you that year went hard in the paint, to use a basketball term, in 2020 and a year after, you then have to find yourself working with them to get a contract. And so it's this paradigm of balancing politics and then trying to stand up for your officers. It's very difficult to overcome.
One of the things I often hear, Mike, I'm in social services, and so is Jody, actually. And I know Marty has some experience in this area too. And there's a term I use. I actually train a behavior management course that talks about de-escalation when you're working with people that have schizophrenia and mental health issues. And one of the things that I often bring up in my training is the fact that, we've all heard the term armchair quarterback. There's a term I use called armchair psychiatrist. And it's this belief that when working with someone that does struggle with mental health, that if I was there and, there was this better understanding of mental health issues, then the situation would not have turned out how it did. And which is very naive to say. That's why I say it's an armchair psychiatrist. But often in my field, what I hear is that, well, if there was more social workers that responded to certain situations than police officers, then that might minimize the number of incidents that occur. I mean, what is your opinion on that?
Well, I think there's reasonableness in that take. But I always revert back to, we're like almost, we've been doing, I think the term de-escalation has been overused. Really? And it has been defined and used by activists who are pushing an ideological action to propel their activism to whatever ideology they're trying to acquire or trying to prop up. The bottom line is I've been here for 24 years and we've been de-escalating in almost any contact that we have contact with the community. And in fact, this agency, I think, led the effort in procuring a relationship and collaboration with mental health professionals in the early 2000s. And we've been doing it for a very long time. In fact, our crisis intervention team, I think, is applauded as being forward-thinking, very progressive. And we've had for over a decade a great partnership with having MHPs, mental health professionals, go along with us on crisis calls. But I do see, police are called to solve problems. And we're the last tool to solve a societal problem. And, this is a huge conversation to talk about, well, how did mental health become such an issue in major urban cities? Well, I've heard debates where you go back to the Reagan administration where, mental health hospitals were shut down and then people were put to the street, and then it becomes society's problem. And then where do you put people? And then they engage, unfortunately, more often than not, in substance abuse, and then it becomes a criminal problem, and the police get intervention. And then, when we can't solve it by using our de-escalation skills, what else do you have to do? You have to try to take them into custody because they're a harm to themselves and others, and obviously the police. And sometimes those contexts can go bad, and that it's a tragic incident. One example that I can point to is the tragic killing of Charlene Lyles here in 2017, where not many people talk about this, but I believe it was a week prior to her death. Similar situation where police were called, and we successfully de-escalated that incident where she was using scissors to threaten her kids, and then obviously police, and we were able to talk her down and get her into custody and then take her to the mental health professionals to try to give her treatment. But sadly, she was released, and then here we are a week later, same incident, and that time she wasn't successful in having law enforcement take her life, and then she forced law enforcement hands, and then here we are. So it's a tragic situation where there's really no true solution.
Well, and you win and you lose.
You win and lose, and we welcome social efforts to try to find an alternative to police intervention. But I think you have to have a police component. If you have, those social workers reach out without armed police and that contact goes south, then you're going to have somebody there to try to protect that social worker. So it's a balance that we're negotiating, ironically enough, with contract negotiations, and we're happy to do so and find if the community wants a different solution or a different look or a different view of this, we'll definitely participate in those calls, because quite honestly, guys, we're just humans trying to do a job to solve a human problem.
Right.
We're not superheroes. We have extra training, but I'll add, and I won't take up all the time here. I just definitely talk a lot, and I apologize for that. But
well, that's fine. Well, thank you very much for being our guest tonight. And
Okay.
remember,
Nice to meet you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure. Great insight.
very
Marty,
good.
I'll send you, maybe you already have the links to our website and whatnot, but if you want me to resend it so you can put it on this when you guys push it.
Okay, I will. I do have a link, and I will send it to you.
Okay. Thanks,
Okay.
guys.
Yeah, God bless, Mike.
God bless
Thank you very much, Mike. Well, thank
Take
you,
care.
everybody, for another episode of Civil Clarity Reports. We will see you next time.